For thousands of years, the story of Moses has been told as though it began on the banks of the Nile, but what if the story reaches back much farther? Long before Egypt's pyramids rose above the desert, the people of Mesopotamia preserved traditions of wisdom, gardens, flowing rivers, and divine law. Among their most revered figures were Enki, called Ea by the Akkadians, the bringer of wisdom and life-giving waters, and Utu, later known as Shamash, the divine guardian of justice. Centuries later, another remarkable civilization flourished along the Nile under one of history's most influential women, Queen Tiye. Could these worlds have been connected? Did memories carried from Mesopotamia pass through Egypt's royal court before emerging in the stories we now know as Genesis and Exodus? In this presentation, we will follow that trail, not by beginning with conclusions, but by following the historical evidence, the ancient texts, and the recurring enigmas that have survived for more than 3,000 years. Our journey begins in Mesopotamia with Enki, known to the Akkadians as Yah. Enki was associated with wisdom, fresh water, craftsmanship, fertility, and the ordering of civilization. Rivers flowed from his domain, bringing life to fields, gardens, animals, and people. He was not merely a god of water, but a keeper of knowledge, the one who understood how the world was meant to function. In the earliest traditions, water and wisdom belonged together. Life depended upon both. A garden could not flourish without flowing water, and a people could not flourish without knowledge, order, and compassion. These themes will return again and again: the sacred garden, the river of life, the tree, the command, and the wisdom that can either preserve life or transform it. Long before Genesis described a garden planted in Eden, Mesopotamia was already telling stories in which divine wisdom flowed like water into the human world. As Mesopotamian civilization matured, another figure rose to prominence. Shamash, known earlier as Utu, was the god of the rising sun. Each morning his light crossed the heavens, revealing what darkness had concealed. For that reason he became associated with justice, truth, judgment, and righteous law. Kings appealed to Shamash as the divine source of fair government, and judges invoked his name when rendering decisions. To the people of Mesopotamia, the sun did more than warm the earth. Its light exposed falsehood, protected the innocent, and reminded rulers that no action remained hidden forever. Justice, like the sunrise, belonged to everyone. As our investigation continues, we will encounter other names and traditions that seem to preserve these same themes of light and law. One of them is the House of Shammai. Whether that resemblance reflects coincidence, shared ideas, or memories preserved through ancient enigmas is one of the questions we will continue to explore. From the waters of Enki-Yah, we now follow the light of Shamash as our journey turns toward Egypt. Ideas rarely travel alone. Long before the great empires of Greece and Rome, merchants, diplomats, craftsmen, and scribes carried languages, technologies, religious traditions, and stories across the ancient Near East. Mesopotamia and Egypt were not isolated civilizations. They traded with one another for centuries. Royal courts exchanged gifts, rulers negotiated alliances, and educated scribes communicated across kingdoms using Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy. Ideas crossed deserts just as surely as caravans did. By the 14th century BCE, Egypt stood at the center of this international world. Queen Tiye's court welcomed ambassadors from every direction. Foreign craftsmen, scholars, merchants, and officials brought with them not only goods but also the accumulated wisdom of neighboring civilizations. If memories of Enki-Yah and Shamash survived beyond Mesopotamia, Egypt would have been one of the most likely places where those traditions could meet, mingle, and evolve. Our journey now follows that trail into the remarkable court of Queen Tiye. Queen Tiye was far more than the wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. She was a trusted advisor, diplomat, administrator, and one of the most influential royal women in Egyptian history. Her name appeared in international correspondence, and foreign kings addressed her directly with respect, normally reserved for pharaohs themselves. The world that surrounded Tiye was unlike any Egypt had known before. Her court welcomed ambassadors, merchants, craftsmen, physicians, and scribes from across the Near East. Languages, ideas, religious traditions, and scientific knowledge converged in a single royal household. Gardens flourished beside lakes and canals. Scribes recorded treaties and diplomatic exchanges. Artists, architects, and scholars worked together under royal patronage. It was a court devoted not only to power, but also to learning, beauty, and international cooperation. Yet this international world also depended upon carefully maintained boundaries. Foreign women could become part of Egypt's royal household through diplomatic marriages, while the royal bloodline itself was closely protected. The lives of princes, princesses, servants, foreign workers, and visiting dignitaries were governed by rules that preserved both political alliances and dynastic succession. The queen's daughters would have been considered forbidden fruit if ancient traditions carried from Mesopotamia continued to evolve beyond their homeland. Queen Tia's court may have been one of the most fertile places for that exchange to occur. From this extraordinary court, our investigation now turns to the heir who seemed destined to inherit it all, Prince Thutmose. Standing beside Queen Tia was the young man expected to become Egypt's next great pharaoh. Prince Thutmose was the eldest son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tia. He was heir to the throne and served as high priest of Ptah, preparing from childhood for leadership over one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Then, quite unexpectedly, he vanished from history. The historical record tells us that the younger prince, Amenhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, inherited the throne instead. The circumstances surrounding Thutmose's disappearance remain remarkably obscure. No detailed account explains his fate, and no accepted tomb has conclusively answered the mystery. For centuries, historians have simply assumed that he died before his father, but is that the only possibility? As we continue our investigation, we will consider another question. Could the disappearance of Egypt's firstborn prince preserve the memory of a different story, one that later generations remembered under another name? Our journey now follows the younger brother who inherited the crown, Akhenaten. With the disappearance of Prince Thutmose, the future of Egypt changed dramatically. His younger brother, Amenhotep IV, unexpectedly became heir to the throne. Within only a few years, he would adopt the name Akhenaten and initiate one of the most remarkable religious transformations in history. For more than 1,000 years, Egypt had honored a rich pantheon of gods and goddesses. Akhenaten challenged that tradition by elevating the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, to unprecedented prominence. Temples were closed, ancient priesthoods lost influence, and a new royal city rose in the desert at Akhenaten. Whether this represented true monotheism, devotion to supreme deity, or profound political reform remains the subject of scholarly debate. For our investigation, another question is equally important. Did the disappearance of the firstborn prince and the rise of Akhenaten preserve the memory of events that would later echo in the traditions of Genesis and Exodus? As we continue, we will examine whether those echoes point to coincidence or to memories carried forward through history and preserved in ancient enigmas. Akhenaten's religious revolution transformed more than Egypt's temples. At the center of his new faith stood the Aten, represented not by an animal or a human figure, but by the radiant disk of the sun, whose rays extended life to all creation. For the first time in Egyptian history, a single divine power was elevated above the traditional pantheon. Light itself became the visible expression of divine authority. Whether viewed as religious reform, political revolution, or something even more profound, Akhenaten's reign marked a decisive break with the past. As we continue our investigation, another possibility emerges. Could some of the ideas that later appear in Genesis and Exodus have passed through this extraordinary period of Egyptian history? The sacred garden, the source of life, divine command, the firstborn, departure from an established order. These themes will soon appear again, not in Egypt, but in the Hebrew scriptures. Our journey now follows those recurring patterns to discover whether they preserve distant historical memories or something even older, hidden within the ancient enigmas. As our investigation moves from Egypt to the Hebrew scriptures, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. The story opens in a sacred garden, a river gives life to the land, a tree stands at its center, a divine command establishes order, a choice changes history, a departure follows. Centuries later, another story begins with a leader raised in Egypt. Again we encounter a divine calling, a sacred mountain, a people departing, a journey toward a new beginning. Whether these parallels represent direct historical memory, literary adaptation, or echoes preserved across generations remains an open question. What is clear is that the same themes continue to reappear. Gardens, light, law, the firstborn, departure, new beginnings. As we continue, we will examine whether these recurring patterns may point to a historical setting long before the stories were written down. As we follow this trail through Egypt, one name deserves special attention. The name Thutmose means, in essence, born of Thoth. The element Mose, or Ms, appears in many Egyptian royal names, including Ahmose, Thutmose, and Rameses. It simply means born of or child of. When the divine name is removed, what remains is Mose. Most scholars recognize that the biblical name Moses reflects this Egyptian linguistic heritage, even though the Book of Exodus later provides its own Hebrew explanation for the name. For our investigation, however, the language raises another question. If Egypt already preserved the name Mose, could later generations have remembered an Egyptian prince, official, or leader simply by that surviving name? We cannot answer that question with certainty, but as our investigation has shown, history sometimes preserves events, while names preserve memories, and sometimes a single surviving name becomes the thread that leads us back to a forgotten story. By now, a new possibility begins to emerge. Suppose the story remembered as the Exodus did not begin with an entire nation leaving Egypt. Suppose it began with a much smaller departure. Imagine a royal prince disappearing from the historical record, a community leaving the protection of Egypt, a journey toward a new identity. Over generations, memories grow, details merge, and history becomes story. The prince becomes Moses, the travelers become a nation, the departure becomes the Exodus. One image, however, may preserve an even deeper enigma. Moses stands between the parted waters. For many readers, this miracle marks God's power to save, but perhaps it also symbolizes a crossroads, two paths, two traditions, two ways of understanding the divine. Another image may invite a similar question. Moses descends the mountain carrying two tablets. One set is shattered, leaving fragments to be gathered and understood by those willing to search for what has been broken. The other bears 10 commandments, complete, orderly, and immediately understood. Were these images intended to preserve two different streams of memory, one openly proclaimed, the other hidden in fragments, awaiting reassembly? This presentation cannot answer that question with certainty, but if these images are ancient enigmas, Moses stands at their center, between two paths, between two tablets, and perhaps between two traditions whose stories have flowed together for more than 3,000 years. By the 6th century BCE, Jerusalem had fallen, and many of its people lived in exile in Babylon. There, surrounded by one of the greatest libraries and scholarly traditions of the ancient world, priests and scribes undertook one of history's most extraordinary literary achievements. They gathered traditions that had been preserved for centuries, genealogies, laws, poetry, royal records, prophetic writings, and ancient oral memories, and wove them together into a unified narrative that became the Torah. Its surface message could be read by every generation. But another possibility deserves consideration. What if those same scholars intentionally preserved older memories within the very consonants of the text? What if one Torah was meant to be read, while another was meant to be discovered? Like fragments of a shattered tablet waiting to be reassembled, recurring names, unusual word choices, and carefully constructed enigmas may have preserved a second layer of memory beneath the familiar story. If so, the Torah becomes something remarkable, not simply a book of law, not merely a history, but a masterpiece of literary design capable of speaking plainly to every reader while quietly inviting future generations to reconstruct the deeper story hidden within its ancient consonants. For centuries after the Babylonian exile, these traditions continued to develop. By the 1st century, Jewish history remembers two great schools of interpretation. The House of Hillel and the House of Shammai both honored the Torah. Yet they often differed in how it should be understood and lived. One tradition emphasized compassion, mercy, reconciliation, and the dignity of every human being. The other placed greater emphasis on obedience, boundaries, legal precision, and covenantal discipline. Did these schools preserve memories of far older streams of thought? Did they teach a Torah of 10 commandments and a Torah that had to be reassembled from scattered pieces? Perhaps it is not surprising that later generations heard more than one message within it. By the time Jesus appeared in Galilee, those two paths had become impossible to ignore. When asked which commandment was greatest, he answered, "Love." When confronted with sacrifice, he quoted Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Again and again, his teachings emphasized forgiveness, humility, healing, care for the poor, love of enemies, and the golden rule. Jesus' words consistently invite his listeners toward mercy rather than vengeance, reconciliation rather than exclusion, compassion rather than ritual. If our investigation has followed one continuous thread from Enki-Yah through Shamash, Queen Tiah, Moses, Babylon, and finally the two great schools of Judaism, then perhaps Jesus did not begin a new path. Perhaps he simply chose one. Every investigation eventually reaches a place where certainty ends and curiosity begins. We have traveled from the rivers of Mesopotamia through the wisdom of Enki-Yah, the light of Shamash, the remarkable court of Queen Tiah, the mystery of Prince Thutmose, the religious revolution of Akhenaten, the enduring memory of Moses, the scholars of Babylon, and finally the two paths that stood before Judaism in the days of Hillel and Shammai. Along the way, we have asked a simple question. What if ancient names were more than names? What if recurring images, repeated patterns, and carefully preserved consonants were intended to carry memories across generations, not replacing history, but preserving another layer beside it? Perhaps the Torah was written not only to be read, but also to be explored, not only to preserve laws, but to preserve questions. Whether these patterns represent intentional enigmas or remarkable coincidences is for each reader to decide. But every fragment we have examined points in the same direction: compassion, wisdom, light, the search for truth. Perhaps that has been the message all along, not hidden from us, but waiting patiently for each generation, willing to gather the broken pieces and begin the journey again.